He had not meant to listen. This was important to him, afterward, the fact that he had not meant to. He was not a man who listened at walls, who pressed his ear to plaster and attended to other people's private hours. He had lived in this house for 3 years and had been, in that time, a perfectly unremarkable neighbor. Quiet, unobtrusive, present only in the minimal way that occupying a building required. He went to bed at 11. He closed his eyes. He did what he had trained himself to do every night since Caroline died, which was to lie in the dark and feel nothing in particular until the nothing became sleep. It had taken him 4 months to learn this. He had gotten quite good at it. Then the sound came through the wall. He wasn't certain at first what it was. It was that quiet, that careful, that contained, almost beneath the threshold of hearing, the kind of sound that existed at the very edge of a thing rather than in the middle of it. He lay still and listened without deciding to listen, the way you listen to rain before you knew it was raining. Then he understood what it was. She was crying. Not dramatically. Not the way grief announced itself in novels, with great heaving sobs and the full orchestration of despair. This was something much smaller and much worse than that, the sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard and almost succeeding. The sound of a woman who had decided that falling apart was perhaps unavoidable, but being witnessed doing it was not something she was willing to allow. She did not know about the walls. He did. He had known since the first winter he spent here, when the house on the other side had been occupied by a retired colonel who snored with the committed regularity of a man at peace with himself and the world. The walls of these Belgrave Square townhouses were elegant and expensive and made, at their core, of very nearly nothing. Sound moved through them the way light moved through gauze, diffused, softened but present. Entirely, unmistakably present. He lay in the dark and listened to his new neighbor cry, and felt something he had spent 3 years successfully not feeling begin, in the region of his chest, to move. He told himself it was only sympathy. He had enough honesty to know, even in that first moment, that it was already more than that. The house on the right had been empty for 6 weeks. Edmund had noted this with the mild, uninvested attention he gave most things in his immediate environment, a fact filed, requiring nothing from him. The removal van had come on a Thursday. He had been at his desk and had heard it, the particular sounds of a household arriving, boxes and furniture, and the voices of people arranging things, the domestic percussion of a life being installed somewhere new. He had not gone to the window. Mrs. Webb, his housekeeper, had gone to the window. This was her prerogative and her custom, and he had long since stopped having opinions about it. A young woman, she had reported, returning to the study with the air of someone delivering a briefing. Well-dressed. Moving in alone, by the look of it, though there's a great quantity of furniture for one person. Good furniture, Edmund had said, which was his standard response to neighborhood intelligence, and conveyed accurately that he had heard without committing to any particular interest in what he had heard. She looks, Mrs. Webb had added, with the precision of a woman who chose her words carefully and meant them fully, tired. Edmund had looked up from his papers at that. Mrs. Webb had already left the room. He had seen her twice in the following fortnight. Once in the street, a glimpse really, as she stepped into a carriage, a dark coat, a straight back, gone before he'd properly looked. Once at the shared garden gate, where they had achieved the particular choreography of 2 people arriving at the same point from different directions, and managing it with the minimum of interaction. A nod, a slight adjustment of path, the fluid non-encounter of city living. He had noticed, because he noticed things whether he wished to or not, that she was precisely as Mrs. Webb had described. Well-dressed, good posture, and underneath both of those things, held in place by both of those things, something that had the quality of a structure being maintained under considerable pressure. Not fragile, the opposite of fragile, actually. The kind of composure that was not natural ease but earned endurance, which was harder to achieve and more expensive to sustain. He had not introduced himself. This was not rudeness, or he did not intend it as rudeness. It was simply that he had become, in 3 years of living largely inside his own life, unpracticed at the ordinary initiations of human connection. He knew this about himself. Mrs. Webb knew this about him, and occasionally expressed her views on the subject with the targeted subtlety of someone who had served a household for 20 years and felt she had earned the right. They had existed in the polite adjacency of London neighbours who shared a wall and a garden gate, and very little else. That was before the Thursday night. He had gone to bed at 11, as he always did. The house was quiet. His house was always quiet, a quality he had cultivated with the deliberateness of a man who understood that noise, for him, was not neutral. Noise required response. Quiet required nothing. He had arranged his life around this understanding and found it, if not satisfying exactly, then at least manageable. He had closed his eyes. He had begun the process, familiar now, almost mechanical, of emptying himself of the day's particulars, of lying in the dark and becoming no one in particular until sleep arrived. 3 years of practice. He was very good at it. Then the sound came through the wall, and he stopped being good at it immediately. He lay still for a long moment after he understood what he was hearing. His first response was the instinct to do something, to move, to act, to address the situation in some concrete way. This instinct arrived and was immediately followed by the understanding that there was nothing to do. He could not go next door. He did not know this woman. He could not knock on the wall. He could not call through the plaster, "I can hear you and I am sorry, and you are not as alone as you think you are." These were not things that could be done. He lay in the dark and was useless and listened. She cried for, he couldn't be certain. Time moved strangely in the dark, perhaps 20 minutes. Perhaps a little less. It was not constant. It came in waves, with pauses between them that felt like someone collecting themselves and then failing to stay collected. Each pause was its own kind of painful. Each return of the sound was worse than the one before, not louder but somehow more exhausting. The sound of a person who had been fighting something for a very long time and was only now, in the privacy of night in an empty house, permitting themselves to lose. He thought about Caroline. He did not often permit himself to think about Caroline in any sustained way. He had found, in the first year after her death, that sustained thinking led to places he couldn't easily return from, and he had developed, out of necessity, the habit of approaching her memory only obliquely, briefly, like looking at something very bright. But tonight the sound through the wall made the habit impossible. Tonight it was simply there, Caroline, 3 years ago, in this same bed, in this same room, with the same quality of night around him, and the same feeling of being entirely unable to do the thing that most needed doing. He had held her hand. That was what he had been able to do in the end. Just that. The sound through the wall eased, slowed, stopped. He lay in the complete silence that followed and felt it, the weight of it, the particular quality of a silence that had replaced something rather than simply existing. Then he got up. He didn't know why he got up. There was nothing to do, he had established this. But lying in the bed felt wrong in a way he couldn't argue with. So he rose and put on his dressing gown and took a candle to the library, because the library was where he went when sleep was unavailable, and he needed somewhere to be that wasn't the bedroom. He lit the lamp. He took a book from the shelf, not looking at the title, just needing something in his hands. He sat in the chair by the cold fireplace. He did not read. He sat in the library with the book open in his lap and thought about the woman on the other side of the wall, and what had brought her here alone, and why her composure in the street had had that particular quality of something maintained rather than felt, and what a person did with grief when they had decided not to let anyone see it. He thought he knew something about that. He sat until the candle burned low. Then he went back to bed and lay in the dark and eventually slept. In the morning, Mrs. Webb told him at breakfast that the new neighbor's name was Mrs. Vane, that she had arrived from the country 6 weeks ago, that she had, as far as Mrs. Webb's considerable intelligence network could determine, no family in London and no visitors to speak of. Edmund listened to this and said nothing. Her housekeeper left last week, Mrs. Webb added, in the particular tone she used when she was providing information that was, in her assessment, actionable. She's managing alone for the moment. Is she? Edmund said. She is. A pause. I thought you should know. Edmund picked up his coffee. Thank you, Mrs. Webb. Mrs. Webb's expression indicated that thank you was not the response she had been aiming for, but she was a professional and she let it go. He saw her that afternoon. He was leaving the house at 2:30, a meeting with his solicitor, a thing he had been putting off and could no longer reasonably avoid, and she was arriving at the same moment, coming up the steps of the house next door with a parcel under one arm and a look of concentrated intention on her face, the look of a woman who had decided what the afternoon required of her and was delivering it. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. They stopped. Up close, for the first time, he could see her properly. She was perhaps 28, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been called handsome rather than pretty, strong bones, a mouth that suggested both precision and feeling, eyes that were, even now, even in the neutral encounter of a doorstep, doing the thing he had noted in the street. Containing something. Maintaining the structure. Her eyes were slightly swollen. Very slightly. She had done an excellent job of managing the evidence. But he knew what he was looking for. Good afternoon, she said. Her voice was even and pleasant and gave nothing away. Good afternoon, he paused. He should have said something, introduced himself, done the ordinary thing. He found that the ordinary thing felt, in this particular moment, insufficient in a way he couldn't explain. Edmund Ashmore, he said. I apologize that I haven't introduced myself sooner. Catherine Vane, a slight incline of her head. Perfectly correct. Perfectly composed. No apology necessary. A brief pause, the pause of two people who have exchanged the required information and are determining whether to exchange anything further. If you need anything, he said, while you're settling in. Mrs. Webb, my housekeeper, is extremely resourceful. I'm sure she would be glad to assist. Something moved across Catherine Vane's face, briefly, quickly, gone before he could name it. Not quite surprise. Something softer than that and more guarded. That's very kind, she said. Thank you, he nodded. He went down the steps. He was at the pavement when he heard her door open and then close, and he walked toward his solicitor's office and thought about nothing in particular, which was not entirely true. That night she cried again. He was in the library this time. He had not gone to bed, or had not yet gone to bed, telling himself it was because he had correspondence to attend to, which was true but not the reason. He was in the chair by the fireplace with the lamp lit, and a letter half-written on the desk when the sound came through the wall. The same quality, the same restraint, the same waves of it, carefully managed, contained to the degree that a person could contain something that was, at its core, uncontainable. He put down his pen. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap and thought about what Mrs. Webb had said. No family in London. No visitors. He thought about a woman arriving in this house 6 weeks ago with good furniture and a tired face and managing alone. He thought about what managing alone looked like at 2 in the morning, when the composure was finally permitted to come down. He went to the piano. It stood in the corner of the drawing room, largely untouched since Caroline's death. She had played beautifully, effortlessly, with the ease of someone who had learned young and never stopped. He had not learned young. He had made several attempts over the years, at Caroline's gentle encouragement, and had achieved a level of competence that could most accurately be described as earnest. He was not good. He had never been good. He sat down at the piano. He placed his hands on the keys. He played slowly, carefully, a simple progression of chords that he had learned years ago and never forgotten, the musical equivalent of walking a familiar path in the dark. Not a melody, not quite, just a shape of sound repeated unhurried. He did not know if she could hear it. He thought she probably could. He played for perhaps 15 minutes. The sound through the wall had stopped. When exactly he couldn't be certain, but at some point in the playing the quality of the house around him had shifted, and the shift had something to do with the wall, and the wall had something to do with her. He stopped playing. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on the keys. That was a strange thing to do, he thought. An entirely strange and probably inexplicable thing. He closed the piano. He went to bed. He lay in the quiet and felt not nothing, as he usually felt, but something less definable and considerably less manageable than nothing, and eventually, later than usual, slept. The morning was clear and cold, a November morning with the particular sharp brightness of early winter in the city. Edmund was at the door at 8:30 on his way to the park. Another habit, the morning walk, the reliable geography of Belgrave Square and the measured circuit of it that gave the day its first solid footing. She was on the steps next door. She turned when she heard his door, and they arrived at the pavement at the same moment, which was becoming, he thought, a pattern. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You play," she said. Not a question. A statement offered carefully, with something behind it he couldn't immediately read, not complaint, not accusation, something considerably more tentative. "Badly," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite. The preliminary of one, the shape that came before, the thing a smile was before it committed to being a smile. "I didn't mind," she said. Then she seemed to reconsider whether to say the next thing and said it anyway. It helped. He looked at her. She looked back, with that composed, contained expression, the structure fully in place, and underneath it, visible only because he had been listening through a wall for 2 nights and knew what the structure was protecting, something that was not composed at all. Something tired and real, and very much in need of the thing she would never have thought to ask for. "I'm glad," he said. She nodded. She turned toward the park. He fell into step beside her, at a distance that was correct and unassuming, and they walked in silence that was not uncomfortable, and Edmund thought, "This is where it begins." He did not say this aloud. But he thought it, and knew it was true, and walked beside her through the cold November morning without asking anything of it at all. November deepened. The days shortened in the way London days shortened in late autumn, not gradually but with a kind of determination, the light withdrawing earlier each afternoon, until by 4 o'clock the square was already dim, and the lamplighters were making their rounds, and the city settled into its evening self, louder and warmer and more compressed than its daytime version. Edmund noticed the season the way he noticed most things, accurately, without sentiment. He noted the change in light, the change in temperature, the way the park looked in the mornings now, stripped and clear and honest in the way that leafless trees were honest. He had always preferred November to October. October performed its dying. November simply got on with it. He noticed other things too, with the same accuracy and considerably more sentiment than he would have preferred. He noticed that Catherine Vane left her house at 8:30 most mornings. That she walked to the park and back, a circuit of perhaps 40 minutes, always alone, always at the same steady pace. That she carried herself on these walks with a quality of deliberateness, as though the walk were not recreation but prescription, something she had decided was necessary, and was delivering to herself with the same efficient care she seemed to apply to everything. He noticed that on the mornings they happened to leave at the same time, which was, increasingly, most mornings. She did not discourage his company. She did not seek it either. But she did not discourage it, and for Edmund, who had spent 3 years in the active discouragement of most human company, this felt like a significant distinction. He noticed that she never mentioned her husband. They talked on these walks in the way that people talked when they were being careful, which was to say, they talked about everything except the things that mattered, and in doing so said more than they intended. She had opinions about London, about the particular quality of city light in November, which she found preferable to summer light, more honest, she said, less effort. About the architecture of the square, which she could read like a text, identifying the decades of different facades with the ease of someone who had looked at buildings her whole life and understood what they were saying. She had read widely and retained everything and spoke about books the way some people spoke about people, as though they were characters in her life, present, influential, worth arguing with. She had argued, apparently at some length, with George Eliot. She found Trollope insufficiently interested in the interior lives of his women, which Edmund thought was probably fair. She had opinions about French literature that were considerably more informed than someone who knew only a little would possess, and he did not remark on this, but he filed it. She was funny. This surprised him, not that women could be funny, but that this woman, with her structure and her composure and her careful management of what was visible, was funny in the dry, precise way that suggested she found the world genuinely amusing rather than performing amusement for anyone's benefit. She said things that made him almost laugh, and then looked at him with an expression of complete innocence, and he thought, there she is. There is the person underneath the architecture. He did not say this either. He was learning, in these November mornings, the particular discipline of enjoying something without reaching for it. The nights were less disciplined. She cried 3 more times in the first 2 weeks, not every night, and not always at the same hour, but with the same quality, the same restraint, the same sound of a woman trying very hard to keep the size of her grief contained to the dimensions of one person. The first time after the piano Edmund simply listened, as he had before, and felt the uselessness of it, and went eventually back to sleep. The second time he went to the piano again. He played the same progression, slowly, quietly, the way you spoke to someone who was frightened without pressure or pace. He played for 20 minutes. The sound through the wall did not stop immediately, but it changed. The quality of it shifted, softened, and eventually, gradually, stilled. The third time he went to the piano, before she had cried for very long at all. He sat down and played and told himself he was not listening for a particular response, and listened for it anyway, and felt something he had no good name for when the silence came. He was aware that this was not normal behavior. He was aware that a man of his position and temperament did not, as a general rule, play the piano badly at midnight because the woman next door was in distress, and he had no other way of being useful. He was aware that if Mrs. Webb knew and Mrs. Webb probably knew because Mrs. Webb always knew, she would have opinions about it that she would express through the medium of significant looks and loaded pauses. He played anyway. Mrs. Webb demonstrated her knowledge on a Thursday morning, with the indirect precision that was her preferred mode of communication on subjects she considered sensitive. "The piano has been getting more use," she said, setting down his breakfast with the studied neutrality of a woman commenting on the weather. "Yes," Edmund said. "That's good," she said. "It ought to be played." A pause. "The acoustics in these houses are quite remarkable." "I've always thought so." "Yes," Edmund said again. Mrs. Webb looked at him. He looked at his eggs. She collected the empty toast rack and left the room, and Edmund thought, "She approves." And then, "I am not certain approval is what this situation requires, but I am going to take it anyway." It was a Thursday afternoon, 11 days into November, when the pattern changed. He had been coming back from his solicitor's when he turned into the square and saw her at the garden gate. She was standing still, which was unusual, looking at something in her hand, a letter he could see as he came closer, a single sheet, read and reread by the look of it, the paper slightly bent from handling. She looked up when she heard his step on the pavement. Something was different in her face. The structure was there. It was always there, but something underneath it had shifted. Some load-bearing element had taken a new weight, and the effort of carrying it was just barely, just momentarily visible. "Good afternoon," he said, stopping at his own gate. "Good afternoon." She folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, and looked at him. He waited. She seemed to be deciding something. He could almost see the decision being made, the internal weighing of what to say and what to keep and where the line was. "Do you," she said carefully, "have a moment? I have a question about the garden gate latch. It seems to be stiff." He looked at the gate latch. It was not stiff. It was a perfectly functional gate latch that had given no evidence of stiffness in the 3 years he had lived here. "Of course," he said. They stood at the gate and he examined the latch that did not need examining, and she stood beside him and said, after a moment, in the tone of someone raising a different subject entirely, "Do you know anything about property law? As it applies to inheritance?" He looked at her. "A reasonable amount." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. The letter was in her coat pocket, and she was not touching it, but she was aware of it. He could tell the particular quality of attention someone gave a thing they were not looking at. "My husband," she said, "has apparently decided that a property which belonged to my mother and which she left to me falls within the scope of certain clauses in our marriage contract." Edmund was still. "His solicitors have written," she said, "to suggest that the matter might be worth reviewing." "The Whitmore property," Edmund said. She looked at him quickly. "You know of it. I know of your family a little. The Whitmore cottage was your mother's. I believe she had it independently of your father." He paused. "What exactly does the letter say?" Catherine removed the letter from her pocket and handed it to him without speaking. He read it once, quickly, then again with the slower attention of someone reading for the architecture of a thing rather than its content. He handed it back. "This is a reach," he said. "The clauses they're citing apply to jointly acquired property. A pre-existing inheritance is on considerably shakier ground." He paused. "But they know that. This letter is not a legal argument. It's a test. A test of what? Of whether you'll fight." He looked at her steadily. "Whether you have anyone to fight with." Catherine looked at the letter in her hand. Her face was very composed. Her jaw was slightly tighter than usual. "I see," she said. "You need a good solicitor," he said. "Not the one you have. Whoever corresponded with your husband's people in the first place. Someone with no prior relationship to the situation. Can you recommend one?" "I can do more than recommend one." He paused. "If you'll permit it." She looked at him. The question was in her eyes, the one she couldn't quite bring herself to ask aloud, which was, "Why? Why would you do this?" He did not answer the unasked question. He answered the one she had asked. "His name is Renfrew. He's been my solicitor for 12 years. He will understand the situation immediately, and he does not lose things he should not lose." Catherine folded the letter, put it back in her pocket, and looked at the garden gate latch that had never been stiff and was not stiff now. "Thank you," she said. It came out differently from the social thank yous she distributed with polished ease. Quieter. More specific. "It's nothing," he said. She looked at him with an expression that said she did not believe it was nothing, and he was not certain he believed it either, and they both let it go. The evenings changed after that. Not dramatically, there was no single shift, no declared alteration. But the quality of the house in the evenings was different now, in a way he noticed and could not entirely account for. He found himself in the library less from habit and more from something that felt, uncomfortably, like preference. He found himself listening, not for the sound through the wall, or not only for that, but with the general attentiveness of a man who had remembered, somewhat against his will, that there were things worth attending to. One evening, late in November, he heard something through the wall that was not crying. He heard movement, the particular sound of furniture being shifted, of boxes being opened or closed, of a space being reorganized. It had a different quality from the stillness that usually preceded the difficult nights. A purposeful quality. An energy that was less grief and more something else, something with direction to it. Then from the other side, very quietly, almost too quiet to catch her voice. Not speaking to anyone, not clearly, just the sound of a word or two, said to herself, in a tone he had not heard from her before. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger. Not the careful, contained, managed quality she brought to everything. This was underneath that older, realer, the thing that had been sitting beneath the grief since long before she arrived in this house. He heard it in the few syllables he could almost catch, in the movement of things being shifted with a slightly more decisive force than necessary. He sat in the library and felt something he had not expected to feel on someone else's behalf. Good, he thought. Good. Anger was life. Anger was a person still in the fight. He had learned this about grief, that the worst of it was not the anger but the flatness that came after, the long gray period when nothing was worth being angry about because nothing was worth much of anything. Catherine Vane was angry. She was going to be all right. He didn't know how he was certain of this. He was certain of it. He went back to his book. The letter from Renfrew came on a Monday. Edmund had written the introduction himself, brief, factual, explaining the situation with the economy of a man who understood that the relevant information was the information, not the feelings around it. Renfrew had responded quickly, as he always did, with an appointment for Thursday and a preliminary assessment that confirmed what Edmund had told Catherine. The solicitation was a reach, the legal grounds were poor, and a firm response would very likely end the matter. He brought the letter to her at the garden gate. They had taken to this, without either of them acknowledging that they had taken to it, the brief morning exchange at the gate before the walk, a natural extension of the pattern that had established itself. She read it, he watched her face as she read, the careful attention she gave written things, the way her eyes moved steadily through the text. She looked up. "He thinks it's manageable," she said. "He does, and you agree." "I do." She looked at the letter again. Something moved across her face, not quite relief, too complicated for relief, more like a person recalibrating a weight they had been carrying and discovering it was slightly less than they thought. "Why are you doing this?" she said. It came out directly, without the usual careful management. A genuine question, asked because she needed the answer, because the not knowing was more uncomfortable than the asking. He considered the question honestly, which was the only way he had ever known how to consider things. "Because it needed doing," he said. "And I was in a position to do it." She looked at him. "That's not all of it." "No," he said. "It isn't." A pause. She waited. "I spent a long time," he said, "in a house that was very quiet. By choice. I convinced myself that quiet was what I wanted." He looked at the gate between them, the latch that had never been stiff. "I'm revising that assessment." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded Renfrew's letter and said, in a tone that was neither acceptance nor rejection but something more careful than either, "I'll go on Thursday." "Good," he said. They went to the park. They talked about Trollope and the architecture of the square, and whether November or March was the more honest month. They did not talk about husbands or solicitors, or the things that came through walls at night. But walking back through the cold, clear morning, when they reached the gate and parted with the small nod that had become their customary goodbye, Edmund thought he saw it just briefly, just for a moment, the smile that had been approaching for weeks, finally committing to being itself. She was already turning toward her door when it arrived. He did not say anything about it. He carried it inside with him, quietly, like something he intended to keep. That night he went to the piano. She had not cried. There was no sound through the wall, just the ordinary settling of the house, the city outside, the normal texture of a night that did not require anything from him. He played anyway. He played for longer than usual without hurry, without the specific purpose of the earlier nights. Not to comfort. Not to reach through the wall toward something difficult. Just playing in the way you did a thing when it had become, unexpectedly and without prior arrangement, part of the shape of your days. He was halfway through his second pass of the progression when he heard it. From the other side of the wall, quiet, faint, but unmistakable. She was humming. Not a melody he recognized. Just a sound, following something in the music, instinctive and unguarded in the way that humming always was, too small a thing to think about doing, done simply because the body responded. He kept playing. She kept humming. The wall between them was 11 inches of plaster and brick, and 3 years of separate silence, and 1 month of careful, unclaimed mornings. It was almost nothing. It was very nearly not there at all. December arrived without ceremony. The first morning of it, Edmund woke to frost on the inside of the window glass. A thing that happened in this house every year. A failure of the old frames that he had been meaning to address for 3 winters, and had not addressed, partly from inertia and partly, he suspected, from the same general disinclination toward domestic improvement that had characterized the last 3 years. The house was functional. The house was adequate. He had not, until recently, felt any particular urgency about its being more than that. He looked at the frost on the glass and thought, for no reason he could have defended, that the frames should probably be seen to before the worst of winter arrived. He mentioned this to Mrs. Webb at breakfast. She looked at him with an expression of such comprehensive and carefully contained satisfaction that he immediately regretted mentioning it. "I'll have someone in," she said, and left the room before he could change his mind. The Thursday morning walk had become the fixed point of the week. Not only Thursday, they walked most mornings now, the 8:30 circuit of the square that had evolved from coincidence to custom, without either of them having proposed it. But Thursdays had a particular quality, because Thursday was the day Catherine went to Renfrew's office, and on Thursday mornings she was slightly more present than usual, the careful management slightly less complete, the real Catherine slightly closer to the surface, braced for the afternoon's practicalities in a way that made her less inclined to perform her composure for anyone's benefit. He valued Thursdays for this reason, and had not told her so. On the first Thursday of December she told him, in the matter-of-fact way she had of delivering significant information as though it were logistical, that Renfrew was confident. The cottage was hers. Robert's solicitors had overreached, and they knew it, and the formal response Renfrew had drafted made this clear in the measured, devastating way that good legal language could make things clear. "He thinks they'll withdraw," she said. "They will," Edmund said. "Renfrew has a particular gift for making the cost of continuing more obvious than the benefit." "Good," she said. Then, after a pause, in a tone slightly different from her usual, quieter, less equipped, "I grew up in that cottage. Summers mostly. My mother used to say it was the only place she felt entirely herself." He looked at her. "I haven't been back since she died," she said. I kept meaning to." She stopped. Robert never wanted to go. Edmund thought about this. About a woman who had kept meaning to return to a place that mattered and had been kept from it, year by year, by a man who had no use for the things that mattered to her. "You'll go in the spring," he said. She looked at him. "Will I? I think so. When this is resolved," a pause. "I think you'll find it still there." She considered this for a moment. Then she said quietly, "That's either very obvious or very reassuring." "I can't decide which." "Both, perhaps," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. He was cataloguing these, the near smiles, the approaching smiles, the smiles that arrived when she wasn't watching for them. He was aware that this was the behavior of a man in a specific condition, and he was choosing, for the moment, to be aware of it without doing anything about it. He had been thinking for some weeks about what to tell her. Specifically, that he had known Robert Vane. The knowing was slight and had taken place some years ago in the context of a world Edmund had largely withdrawn from since Caroline's death, but it had left an impression, the specific, residual impression of a man who had seemed to Edmund, in their few encounters, to be made of surface without depth, charming in the way that some things were charming from a distance and less so upon examination. He had thought about this and thought about it and had not told her, and the not telling had accumulated its own weight. He told himself the reason was timing, that she had enough to carry without him, adding the information that her neighbor had a prior, unflattering impression of the man who had left her. He told himself this and mostly believed it, and partly understood that the other reason was simpler and less defensible. He didn't want to be connected to Robert Vane in her mind, even at the distance of an old acquaintance. This, he acknowledged, was not sufficient reason for continued silence. He told her on a Wednesday morning, the second week of December, with the frost still hard on the pavement and the square empty, except for a woman walking a small dog with the resigned efficiency of someone completing a task. "I should tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I knew your husband." "Slightly. Some years ago, through a mutual business connection. We met perhaps 4 times. I would not have called us acquainted in any meaningful sense. He was in certain circles I moved in before." He paused. "Before my circumstances changed." Catherine walked beside him for a moment without speaking. "You didn't like him," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "I didn't. Why?" He thought about this carefully, because why deserved an honest answer and not a diplomatic one. "He was a man," he said slowly, "who was always in the process of becoming. Always the next thing, the next connection, the next opportunity, the next version of himself that would be better positioned than the current one. It wasn't ambition exactly. Ambition has direction. This was more like, he searched for the word, appetite. Without any particular object." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally quietly. "That's yes." They walked. "When he proposed to me," she said after a while, and this was the first time she had spoken of the beginning of it, he realized, of the time before the damage, he was very certain. Very focused. "I thought it was feeling. I thought that kind of certainty was what feeling looked like." A pause. "I understand now that it was simply the next thing. That I was," she stopped. "That the version of me that came with the things I had was what he wanted. And when the things changed," she didn't finish. "She didn't need to." "You were worth more than the things," Edmund said. "That is a statement of fact, not consolation." She looked at him quickly, a quick, almost startled look, the look of someone who had not expected the directness of it. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she said. "I know you well enough," he said. She looked away. She walked for several steps in silence. "Briefly," she said. He looked at her. "When I asked if you knew him, you said briefly." That was a careful word. "Yes," he said. "I was being careful. You don't need to be careful with me." He looked at her profile, the straight line of it, the set of it, the particular quality of a person who had decided something. "No," he said. "I'm beginning to understand that." That evening, he went to Caroline's room. He did not go often, perhaps once every few months, and always with the same combination of intention and reluctance, the going toward and the bracing against, the particular math of grief. He stood in the room and looked at the things that were still there. A photograph on the dressing table, a small painting she had loved hung by the window, the particular quilt she had brought from her childhood home, folded at the foot of the bed. He stood and thought about Caroline, which he did not often permit himself to do with this much duration and space. She had been easy. That was the word he returned to always. Not simple, she had not been simple. She had been complex and funny and occasionally difficult and entirely herself. But being with her had been easy in the way that breathing was easy, natural, unremarkable, something you understood the value of only when it was gone. He thought about Catherine. He thought about the difference, not a comparison. He was careful not to let it become a comparison. It was not a competition between the living and the dead, and he had no interest in making it one. Just an observation. That Catherine was not easy in the same way. Catherine required attention, required the willingness to look carefully and wait and receive what was given without expecting more. She was worth the effort in the way that difficult things were worth the effort. She would have liked her, he thought. The thought he had had in the first week, standing at this same window, had returned and settled more firmly. Yes, she would have. He did not know if this was permission or simply recognition. He suspected the distinction didn't matter much. He said good night to the room. He did this quietly, without self-consciousness, because it was the right thing to do, and closed the door and went back downstairs. The invitation arrived the following week. A dinner party, Lady Dalmore's annual December gathering, the kind of event that was less an invitation than a social obligation dressed in engraved paper. There was a second envelope with his, delivered to the house next door, with a card that Mrs. Webb reported Catherine had received and spent some time looking at before setting aside. He thought about a woman who had arrived in London 6 weeks ago with no family and no visitors, navigating the slow machinery of a social world that had its own particular cruelties for women in her situation. He knocked on her door that afternoon. She opened it herself and looked at him with the mild surprise of someone who had not expected a caller. "Lady Dalmore's dinner," he said. "Are you going?" A pause. "I wasn't certain. It would be easier," he said carefully, "to go with someone who knew the room." She looked at him. "Is that an offer?" "Yes, to escort me, to arrive together and to know where you are in the room." Which is different from escort technically, but produces similar results. Something moved across her face, the near smile, closer than usual. "That is a very precise distinction. I find precision useful. I've noticed." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Yes, good," he said. He went back to his house. Mrs. Webb was in the hallway with the expression of someone who had not been listening and was not going to pretend otherwise. "We're going to Lady Dalmore's," he said. "I heard," she said. "You were in the kitchen. The acoustics in these houses," she said serenely, "are quite remarkable." He told her, the evening before the dinner, what he knew about Robert's financial situation. Not everything. He did not know everything, and what he knew was second-hand, gathered from the kind of half-overheard conversations that moved through certain business circles. But he knew enough. The debts, the investments that had failed, the particular combination of overconfidence and bad luck that had left Robert Vane facing consequences he had no intention of facing alone. He told her because she deserved to know the full shape of it. Because she had said, "You don't need to be careful with me," and he was choosing to believe her. She sat across from him in the small sitting room she had made of the front room of her house. She had received him properly, for the first time, inside rather than at the gate, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The Countess," she said. "Her family's money. Yes, he didn't leave me for her. He left me for her money. It's possible," Edmund said, "that he distinguished between the two less clearly than you are doing now." She looked at him. "That's generous. It's accurate. Men like Robert Vane are very good at believing what is convenient for them to believe." He may have told himself it was feeling. He may have believed it, at least until the feeling was less convenient than the money. Does the distinction matter? He considered this. Not to the result. Perhaps to what you're carrying. She looked at the fire. The room was warm and small and made habitable through a combination of good furniture, and whatever quality Catherine brought to spaces she occupied. The same instinct for arrangement that showed in the flowers in her hallway, in the particular placing of things that made a room feel considered rather than merely filled. "I loved him," she said. Quietly, without particular emotion, "the way you said a thing that was true and finished. I thought what I felt was the reliable kind. The kind that held." She paused. "I've been trying to understand what it actually was." Now that I know its limits, what have you concluded? That it was real, she said. That the feeling was real, whatever he was doing with his side of it. That I didn't imagine it, she looked up. I think that matters. That I wasn't deceived about my own experience, only about his. He looked at her. At the steadiness of her, the particular quality of a person who had been thinking carefully about a difficult thing and had arrived at something true. Yes, he said. I think that matters very much. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, with the small shift of someone returning from somewhere internal, "You should know that I will almost certainly embarrass you tomorrow evening. I have an unfortunate tendency to say exactly what I think when I encounter hypocrisy at dinner parties." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because you said exactly what you thought about Trollope in the second week of November, and I have been revising my position on him ever since." The smile arrived. The full one, not the preliminary, not the near approach, the actual thing, warm and slightly asymmetrical and entirely, unmistakably her. He had been waiting for it for 6 weeks. It was worth the wait. That night he lay in bed and listened to the house. No sound from the wall. Just the city outside, the distant movement of it, the specific night sounds of Belgrave Square in December, a carriage somewhere, wind against the window glass that misses. Webb's carpenter had seen too, and which now, for the first time in 3 winters, fit properly. He lay in the silence and felt, not nothing, as he had trained himself to feel. Something considerably more alive than nothing, and considerably less manageable. He thought about tomorrow. About a room full of people who would look at Catherine and make their assessments, and about standing in that room beside her, and about the specific pleasure, quiet and private and entirely his own, of knowing her more clearly than any of those people did or would. He thought about the smile. He thought, "I am in trouble." He thought this with the full awareness of a man who had been in trouble for some weeks and had been pretending otherwise. He closed his eyes. He slept well. On the other side of the wall, he thought, she was probably sleeping too. He was fairly certain. Lady Dalmore's dinner was exactly what Edmund had told Catherine it would be. A room full of people he knew, organized around a table long enough to seat 20, and intimate enough that nothing said at one end remained private at the other. He had attended this dinner for 6 years. He had never, until this one, found it interesting. They arrived together, which was noticed. He had expected this, had, if he was honest, prepared for it, by deciding in advance what his position was, and committing to it with enough clarity that deviation would require more energy than most people were willing to spend. His position was simple. He was accompanying his neighbor to a dinner to which they had both been invited. The room noticed them at the door. He felt it, the particular quality of attention that moved through a gathering when something unexpected arrived, a slight adjustment in the ambient conversation, heads turning with the carefully managed casualness of people who were looking without appearing to look. Catherine felt it too. He knew because of the slight straightening, almost imperceptible, the structure going up another degree, the armor adjusted for the room. He walked beside her and did not comment on it and thought, she has been doing this her whole life. Managing rooms. She is better at it than almost anyone here. Lady Dalmore received them with the warmth of a woman who found unexpected social configurations more interesting than expected ones. She held Catherine's hand a moment too long and looked at Edmund with an expression that said several things she was too well-bred to say aloud. "My dear," she said to Catherine, "I'm so very glad you came. It was genuine." Edmund noted this and was grateful for it. The room was navigable. Edmund knew which people to steer toward and which to steer past, and he managed this without appearing to manage it, the skill of someone who had spent enough years in rooms like this to know their geography. He introduced Catherine to 3 people he thought she would find genuinely worth knowing, and 2 he thought she would find genuinely worth avoiding. And he watched her operate in the room with the attention of someone seeing a thing they already admired confirmed. She was extraordinary at this, not in the performed way, not with the bright, effortful sociability of someone working a room, but with the genuine ease of a person who found people interesting and was capable of making them feel so, who asked questions because she wanted the answers and listened because she retained what she heard. Within 20 minutes of arriving, she had made Lady Dalmor laugh, gotten into a genuine argument about agricultural reform with a baronet who was used to being agreed with, and somehow acquired a glass of excellent Bordeaux without appearing to have sought it. Edmund stood slightly to her left and thought, Robert Vane left this woman for a title and a balance sheet. He thought extraordinary. He saw Robert at 8:30. He was standing near the fireplace at the far end of the room, with a glass in one hand and the Countess on his arm. A handsome woman, assembled carefully for a particular effect. Robert himself was unchanged. The same easy occupation of space, the same surface charm operating at its usual frequency, the same eyes that moved around a room taking inventory. Those eyes found Edmund, registered him, then moved, with the particular skill of a man recalibrating a situation, to Catherine. Edmund watched Robert's face in the moment of recognition and filed what he saw there. It was not guilt. It was closer to calculation, a rapid, almost involuntary assessment of the variables. She is here. Ashmore is here. They arrived together. What does this mean for the existing situation? The Countess said something to him. He smiled at her, the full smile, the one that had apparently worked in rooms like this for years. He looked away. Edmund looked at Catherine. She had seen them, of course she had. She saw everything in a room. She was looking at the far fireplace with the composure of someone who had prepared for this possibility and was delivering on the preparation. Her face was entirely correct. Her hand at her side had closed into a loose fist and then released. He moved very slightly closer to her. They managed the dinner well. The table arrangements, mercifully, did not place them near Robert and the Countess. Lady Dalmor had done this deliberately, Edmund suspected, because Lady Dalmor was a woman of considerable social intelligence and no interest in hosting spectacles. Edmund was at Catherine's left, which was not the arranged seating, but had become the seating through the quiet negotiation of place cards that Mrs. Webb would have approved of. Catherine talked through dinner with the person on her right, a retired judge with opinions about everything and the experience to back some of them. And Edmund talked with the woman on his left and watched Catherine from his peripheral vision and thought about the hand closing and releasing and what it had cost her to stand in that room and remain entirely herself. After dinner, in the drawing room, it happened. Edmund was in conversation with a man he barely knew about a subject he had no particular investment in when he became aware, through the specific peripheral attention he had been giving the room all evening, that Robert had crossed it. He was moving toward Catherine. Edmund excused himself. He crossed the room at the pace of a man who was not hurrying, which was not his natural pace, but was the correct one. Hurrying would have made it something it did not need to be, would have transformed an arrival into an intervention, and Catherine did not need an intervention. She needed perhaps a presence. He arrived at her side at approximately the same moment as Robert. Robert looked at him, a calculation, quicker this time, less disguised. Ashmore, Here. Standing here specifically. Vain, Edmund said. Flat civil the minimum. Ashmore. Robert's smile adjusted itself for the configuration. He turned to Catherine. Catherine warmer. Practiced. You look well, thank you, she said. Her voice was even and pleasant and gave nothing to him. Nothing he could use. Nothing that acknowledged the particular intimacy that the use of her first name was attempting to claim. I've been meaning to reach out, Robert said, in the tone of a man mentioning a minor administrative matter. My solicitors, there's been a small misunderstanding about the Whitmore matter, apparently. I wanted to say personally that I hope it hasn't caused you any. It hasn't, Catherine said. Cleanly. Without heat. Robert's smile adjusted again. Good. Good, and a pause. He looked between them, the assessment running again, the recalibration. I didn't realize you were acquainted with Ashmore. We're neighbors, Catherine said. Are you? He said it as though this were new information, which it wasn't. How convenient. Something in the word convenient was not quite neutral. Edmund heard it and chose to address it directly, because direct was almost always better than the alternative. It has been, he said. Particularly when Mrs. Vane required a solicitor's recommendation. I was glad to be useful. Robert looked at him. The smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. Of course, he said. Very neighborly. I think so, Edmund said. A pause. The conversation had reached the point where it could continue or conclude, and everyone present understood that Robert was the one who held that option. He looked at Catherine one more time, the look of a man checking something, assessing something, and Edmund watched it with the steady attention of someone who intended to remember everything about this encounter. It's good to see you looking well, Robert said to Catherine again, and the repetition of it, the use of well both times, as though well were the only condition he was willing to grant her, said more about him than anything else he had said. Goodbye, Robert, Catherine said. He went. They left an hour later. They walked back to Belgrave Square in the cold December air, and Catherine did not speak for most of it, and Edmund did not press her to. He had learned the difference between her silences, the ones that wanted company and the ones that wanted space, and the ones that were simply the silence of a person thinking, which required neither. This one was the thinking kind. He waited. They were nearly at the square when she said, He looked at me like I was a sum he'd already calculated. Yes, Edmund said. Not like a person. Like a position. Something to be assessed for what it meant to him. She paused. I don't think he ever looked at me any other way. I think I mistook the intensity of the calculation for feeling. Edmund said nothing. She was working towards something, and she didn't need him to work toward it with her. I'm not sad, she said. She seemed slightly surprised by this. I thought I would be seeing him. I prepared for it. But standing there, looking at him looking at me like that, I wasn't sad. I was, she paused, clear. I felt very clear. Good, Edmund said. Is it? Clarity about the right things is always good. Whatever it costs to get there. She walked beside him for a moment. You moved across the room, she said. When he came toward me. Yes, you didn't have to, I know. Why did you? He considered the question getting better. He had discovered, at not having prepared answers for her, at letting the real answer arrive rather than sending a managed version ahead. Because I wanted to be there, he said. That's all. I wanted to be standing in that particular spot. She looked at him. He looked back. They stood at the gate between their two houses, the gate whose latch had never been stiff. And the December air was cold and the square was quiet, and the lamp at the corner threw its light across the pavement between them. "Edmund," she said. "Catherine." She looked at him for a long moment, with the full attention she gave things, the real attention, without the management or the structure or the careful composure. "Just looking." "Thank you," she said. "For this evening, it was my pleasure," he said, and meant it entirely in the full sense of the word, not courtesy, not formula. Pleasure. The genuine, specific, unremarkable pleasure of an evening spent in exactly the right company. She went inside. He stood at the gate for a moment after her door closed. He thought, something is going to have to be said. Not tonight. But soon. He went inside. Robert came to her house 3 days later. Edmund did not know this immediately. He was at his solicitor's in the morning and came back at noon to find Mrs. Webb in the hallway with the expression she wore when something had happened that she considered actionable. "He came at 10, she said without preamble. "I saw the carriage from the kitchen." He was inside for a pause calibrated, approximately 40 minutes. Edmund stood in the hallway with his coat still on. "Is she all right?" "She was in the garden at 11:30, Mrs. Webb said. "Sitting." "Not crying." "Just sitting." A pause. She had her hands flat on the table. "The way you do when you need to feel something solid." Edmund took off his coat. "I'll go this afternoon," he said. "Yes," said Mrs. Webb, as though this had never been in question. Catherine opened the door before he knocked. She had been watching from the window. He could tell from the speed of it, the door opening as he came up the steps, and something loosened in his chest at that because it meant she had been waiting, and waiting meant she wanted him there. He filed this. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat in the chair she pointed him to in the sitting room that had become, over the weeks of being admitted to it, familiar. She sat across from him, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been managing something difficult alone all morning and was now, cautiously and with awareness of what it cost, choosing not to manage it alone. "He came about the cottage," she said. "Renfrew was right, they're withdrawing the legal claim." "That part is resolved." She paused. "He came to tell me this personally, which was not required and not requested." Edmund waited. "He came to tell me that he hoped there were no hard feelings. That our separation had been difficult for him as well. That he hoped I understood that decisions made under financial pressure were not always." She stopped. Breathed. He used the word pressure 4 times. I counted. "What did you say?" "Very little." I let him talk. She looked at the window. "He wanted something from me." "Not the cottage, that was already decided." "Something else." "He wanted," she paused, finding the right word, "absolution, I think." "He wanted me to tell him it was all right. That I understood. That there were no hard feelings." "Did you give it to him?" "No." Quiet. "Final." "I told him the matter was in my solicitor's hands, and I considered the conversation concluded." A pause. "He didn't like that." "What did he say?" She looked at her hands. "He said that I had clearly found comfort quickly. Given my present neighborly arrangements." She said the word comfort in a tone that made its intended meaning entirely clear. Edmund was very still. "He said it pleasantly," she said. "That's what he does. Unpleasant things in pleasant tones. He said he was glad I had someone looking after me. That I had always needed." She stopped again. When she continued, her voice was even, but there was something underneath it he recognized. The anger, older and realer than everything else. He said I had always needed someone to take care of things for me. That it was one of my qualities. Edmund looked at her. He is describing a version of you he invented to make his own behavior make sense. The woman who needed taking care of. The woman who couldn't manage. He needed that version to exist so that his departure could be framed as practicality. Inevitability, he paused. It has nothing to do with who you are, she looked at him. I know, she said. I know that. I have known it for some time. But hearing it said aloud, having him stand in this room and tell me who I am, in that pleasant voice, Catherine, she stopped. He is wrong, Edmund said. About all of it. About who you are and what you need, and the version of you that he required to make sense of his own choices. I have watched you manage, since November, everything that has been required of you, the legal matter, the social situation, the whole considerable weight of it, with more competence and more courage than most people would have brought to half the problem. You do not need to be taken care of, he paused. What you need, I think, is someone who is willing to stand in the room with you. Which is different. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, or not only with tears, but with the specific brightness of a person receiving something they had not known they were waiting for. Yes, she said very quietly. That's exactly the difference. The room was very still. Outside, the December afternoon was already dimming toward dark, the light going in the way it went at this time of year, without ceremony. Edmund thought now. Now is the moment to say the thing. He opened his mouth. And Catherine said, he mentioned your wife. Edmund closed his mouth. She was watching him carefully, not unkindly but carefully. He said you'd had a difficult few years. Since your loss, a pause. He said, and I'm telling you this because you told me things you could have kept to yourself, and I think I owe you the same. He said that in his view, you were a man who had been alone long enough to be susceptible to the first sympathetic presence. Edmund looked at her. He was suggesting that what I feel is loneliness. Dressed as something else, yes, a silence. And you're asking me whether he's right. She held his gaze. She did not look away. I'm not asking. I'm telling you what he said, and trusting you to respond to it honestly. He sat with this the way he sat with things that deserve to be sat with fully, without hurrying toward the answer. I have been alone, he said. That's true. 3 years. And loneliness does things to a person. It changes the aperture. Makes certain things visible that might not have been visible otherwise. He paused. But that's true of everything that happens to us. Caroline's death changed what I could see. The loneliness changed what I could see. Being in proximity to you these 2 months has changed what I can see. He looked at her. The question isn't whether the circumstances shape the feeling. Circumstances always shape feeling. The question is whether the feeling is true. And is it? She said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. It is. The word landed in the room and stayed there, solid and irreversible and entirely, simply true. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, in the tone of someone putting something down that they had been carrying for some time, I think he knows that. I think that's why he said it. Because a man who is merely lonely and susceptible is manageable. Dismissible, she paused. A man who is neither of those things is something else. What is he? She looked at him. A reason, she said, to leave well enough alone. The silence between them was the warmest silence Edmund had ever sat inside. He thought, say it. Now. Say the thing. He said, Catherine, the door knocker sounded. They both looked at the door. Agnes appeared in the doorway. I beg your pardon. A Mr. Renfrew, ma'am. He says it's urgent. Catherine looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at Catherine. He'll have the formal withdrawal, he said. From Robert's solicitors. It will need signing. She stood, smoothed her dress, became in the space of a breath entirely composed the structure back in place. But she looked at him, just before she went to the door, with an expression that had nothing composed about it. Stay, she said. If you can. Yes, he said. He stayed. That night Edmund lay in bed and listened to the house. No sound from the wall. No sound at all, just the city, the specific December silence of it, and the warmth of the house around him, and the memory of a sitting room and a fire, and a reason to leave well enough alone said in a voice that meant the opposite. He thought about the thing he had been about to say. The thing that had been waiting for 6 weeks, in the library and on the walks and at the gate, and in every near smile he had catalogued, and every silence he had sat inside. He thought tomorrow. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, the silence felt like something it had never felt like before. Full, he thought. It feels full. He slept. The withdrawal came through on a Friday. Renfrew's letter arrived at Catherine's door in the morning. A single page, formal, efficient, the language of a legal matter concluded. The Whitmore cottage was hers. Robert's solicitors had retracted their position. The matter was, in Renfrew's measured phrasing, resolved without further complication. Catherine read it at the kitchen table, alone, with her morning tea going cold beside her. She had expected to feel more. Relief, certainly, and relief was there, a loosening of something that had been held tight for weeks. But underneath, the relief was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of stillness. The particular quality of a thing that had been fought for and won, and was now simply done, sitting on the table in front of her, asking nothing further. She thought about the cottage. Her mother's kitchen, the particular smell of it, old wood and lavender, and something she had never identified but had always associated with the feeling of being entirely safe. Summer mornings. Her mother at the window, coffee in hand, looking at the garden with the expression of a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be. You'll go in the spring, Edmund had said. She thought she would. She folded the letter and put it in the left-hand drawer of the desk, where she kept the things that mattered. Then she sat at the kitchen table and thought about yesterday evening, about a sitting room and a fire and the word yes said with the particular quality of something irreversible, and a maid arriving at the wrong moment, and stay said across a room with everything in it, and an evening spent with Renfrew's formalities and Agnes's tea and Edmund beside her, not filling the silence but being inside it, which was a different thing and considerably more valuable. He had left at 9. At the door he had paused. She had felt the pause, the specific weight of something that wanted to be said being held back for reasons she understood and found, simultaneously, entirely correct and extremely frustrating. She thought, say it. She thought, I am going to make him wait one more day because I don't trust myself yet, and then I am going to stop making him wait. She drank her cold tea and went to get dressed. She did not see him that morning. This was unusual enough to notice, she noticed, which was its own information. She had grown accustomed to the 8:30 door, the coinciding of their departures, the walk that had become as much a part of the morning as the tea. She went to the park alone and felt the absence of him as a specific thing, a shape in the air beside her where he usually was, which was. She examined this with the directness she applied to things she would rather look away from, not a comfortable discovery. She thought about what Robert had said. A man who has been alone long enough to be susceptible. She had told Edmund about it because she owed him honesty, and because she had needed to see what he did with it. Whether he would retreat into management, offer her a careful diplomatic response, give her the version of himself that handled things. He hadn't. He had sat with it and answered it plainly, and the answer had been yes, it is true. She believed him. She also believed, and this was the thing she had been sitting with since yesterday evening, turning it over in the careful way she turned over things that mattered, that her own position was not so different. She had arrived in this house in November with nothing intact except her composure, and the cottage and the anger she hadn't yet identified as a resource. She had been in the state that grief and betrayal left a person, raw underneath the structure, susceptible in the way that anyone was susceptible when they had recently been shown the limits of their own judgment. So perhaps Robert was right about both of them. Perhaps two people in particular conditions had simply found each other at the right moment, and what felt like something was actually only circumstance and proximity, and the basic human need for warmth in a cold house. She walked and considered this with genuine honesty, and arrived, by the time she reached the far end of the park, at the following conclusion, that it didn't matter. Not because the question was unimportant, but because she had looked at it directly and found that the answer, whatever it was, did not change what was true. She had been in Edmund Ashmore's company for 7 weeks. She knew him not completely, not yet, but truly, in the way that people knew each other when the circumstances removed the performance. She knew how he thought. She knew what he found funny, and what he found intolerable, and how he looked when he was being careful, and how he looked when he had stopped. She knew that he had loved Caroline and grieved her properly, and was, as a result, a person who understood what it was to love something real. That knowledge had not come from her situation. It had come from him. She turned around at the far end of the park and walked back faster. He came at 2 o'clock. She was in the sitting room when Agnes announced him, with Renfrew's letter in her hand, because she had taken it out of the drawer to read again for no particular reason. He came in and looked at her and looked at the letter and said, "Good news." "Yes," she said. "Entirely good." He sat down. She put the letter on the table between them. "How do you feel?" "Clear," she said. "The same as at Lady Dalmore's, but more so." "Cleaner." She looked at the letter. "I was thinking about the cottage this morning. About going in the spring. You should." "I will." She looked up at him. "You were right. I think it will still be there." He looked at her with the attention she had grown used to and had not grown accustomed to. There was a difference, she had found, between used to and accustomed to. You grew used to things. Some things you never stopped noticing. "I didn't come about the letter," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. "I was going to say something yesterday," he said. Before Renfrew's timing intervened. "I know that too." He looked at her. "Are you going to let me say it?" "Yes," she said. "I'm going to let you say it." He was quiet for a moment, not managing himself. She could see, just arriving at it, the way he arrived at things without hurry. "I have been thinking about what I want to say for approximately 6 weeks," he said, "and I have also been thinking about when to say it. Whether the circumstances were, whether there was too much happening, too many other things requiring your attention. Whether I was," he paused. "Whether this was something you needed on top of everything else." "Edmund," she said. "Yes, the circumstances have not improved. There will always be something happening. That is the nature of circumstances." He looked at her. "Also," she said, "I am going to tell you something because you have consistently told me true things and I owe you the same." She held his gaze. "I went to the park alone this morning, and the absence of you was a specific and noticeable thing. I found this uncomfortable, She paused. I thought you should know. Something happened in his face, the management going entirely all at once, like a window opened. I have been not saying something for 6 weeks, he said. Because I didn't know if the timing was right. Because I didn't want to add to the weight of what you were carrying. Because I was, if I'm entirely honest, afraid that what I felt was too much too quickly, and that the right thing was to wait longer to be more certain to make sure. And are you certain? She said. Yes, he said. I have been certain for some time. I was waiting for a better moment, and I have concluded that the better moment is not coming and I should simply speak. Then speak, she said. He looked at her. I would like to stop being next door, he said, with the directness of a man who had decided that directness was the only thing left. I would like to be in the same house. I would like to be the person who is in the room with you. Not because you need someone in the room, you don't. I know you don't. But because I find that being in the room with you is the best use I have found for a room in several years, and I would like to continue doing it. Indefinitely. Catherine looked at him. She thought about November. About a wall and a sound through it, and a man she had not met playing a piano badly in the middle of the night, because it was the only thing he could do. She thought about the park this morning, about the shape of his absence beside her. She thought I was so careful. I was so certain that careful was what this required. She thought, I am tired of careful. There is something I need to tell you first, she said. He waited. I thought this morning that perhaps Robert was right. That we had both arrived at a particular moment in particular circumstances, and that what felt real was actually only proximity. She held his gaze. I considered this seriously. I wanted to be honest about the possibility, and, he said, and I concluded that it doesn't matter. That I know you truly, not circumstantially, and that what I know is the basis of something real. She paused. I also concluded that I am extremely tired of being careful, and that careful has not, in my experience, produced the results it promised. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, open, fully, without reservation. I thought, she said, and then stopped, because what she had thought was large and she was going to say it anyway. I thought, when I arrived here, that I was coming to London to manage a legal situation and rebuild something from what was left. I did not think I was coming here to find something. I was very sure I was not ready to find anything. She looked at him. I find that I was wrong about that. Edmund was very still. Catherine, he said. Yes, she said. That wasn't a question, I know. It was an answer anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, with the full, unhurried attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, and had never stopped noticing. Then he said, I would like to ask you something. Properly. When the time is right, he paused. I'm not asking now because I don't want the answer to be given in the middle of a difficult month, when everything is unresolved and you've been managing too much for too long. I want to ask when things are quieter. When you have had time, she looked at him. How much time? As much as you need. And if I need very little. Something moved across his face, the smile, the real one, the one she had catalogued without knowing she was cataloguing it. Then, he said, I will ask very soon. The problem arrived the following week. Not from Robert, that door at least was closed. It arrived in the form of Lady Mowbray, which was to say it arrived in the form of a woman who had spent 30 years as the primary distributor of social consequence in a radius of 40 miles, and had no intention of retiring from the position. Edmund told Catherine about the invitation, Lady Mowbray's annual Christmas gathering, a thing of some social significance, an event at which absence was noted as carefully as presence. He had attended for years. Catherine had received an invitation, which surprised her. "She's testing," Catherine said. "Yes," Edmund agreed. "She wants to see how you present." "How I present," she repeated, in the dry tone she used when something was both accurate and absurd. "How you present," he said, without apology, "and whether what people are saying about you and about, a slight gesture between them, is the kind of thing she wishes to include in her social geography or manage against." Catherine looked at him. "And what are people saying?" "The usual. That you arrived in London alone in November. That you are seen regularly in my company. That the connection is," he paused, "unexplained." "Unexplained," she said. "Unexplained covers a great deal of territory. Some of it flattering, some of it less so." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her process it, the information, the implications, the particular social calculation he knew she was capable of, and found, usually, slightly tedious but occasionally essential. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "Tell me?" "Last month I would have found this conversation frightening. Not the content, the stakes. The idea that people were looking, assessing, deciding things about me based on how I presented." She looked at the window. "I have spent a great deal of my life managing how I presented. Adjusting it. Making it acceptable." She looked back at him. "I find I'm not very interested in doing that anymore." He looked at her. "I'm not saying I'll behave badly at Lady Mowbray's," she said. "I won't. I know how to behave in rooms like that. But I'm going because I choose to go, and I'm going with you because I choose to. And if that is unexplained, then it will have to remain unexplained until I decide otherwise." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "That," he said, "is exactly the right position." "I thought so," she said. Lady Mowbray's house was 3 times the size of anyone else's idea of a house, and furnished with the accumulated conviction of several generations who had all believed, unanimously, that more was more. Edmund watched Catherine walk into it and thought, she was made for rooms like this, and she has spent years being made to feel that she wasn't. Lady Mowbray received them. She was a small, precise woman of 70, who had outlasted 3 husbands and 4 prime ministers, and showed no signs of diminishing on any front. She looked at Edmund with the familiar expectation of someone who had known him for 20 years, and then she looked at Catherine with the specific, comprehensive assessment of a woman who had made assessments her life's work. The assessment lasted approximately 10 seconds. Then Lady Mowbray said, "My dear, I knew your mother. She was a remarkable woman." Something in Catherine's face changed, quickly, briefly, a crack in the structure through which something real moved. "She was," Catherine said. "Yes, the Whitmore cottage," Lady Mowbray nodded. "She loved that place. I'm glad it's staying in the right hands." She looked at Edmund. A pause waited with a great deal of unspoken history. "You're looking better than I've seen you in years, Edmund." "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. It's not a compliment, it's an observation." She moved on to the next guests, because she always moved on, and that was the end of the official portion of the evening. Catherine looked at him. "The Whitmore cottage," she said. "She knows everything," Edmund said. "She has always known everything. The question is only what she does with it. And what is she going to do with it?" He watched Lady Mowbray across the room, working the gathering with the efficiency of someone who had never wasted a social moment in her life. "Nothing against you," he said. "Not now." "You passed." "I passed," Catherine repeated. "How gratifying. The observation about my appearance was the signal." "She approves." Catherine looked at him. "You care what she thinks. I care what it means for you." Lady Mowbray's approval doesn't determine anything, but her disapproval makes certain things harder. She has just made certain things easier. Catherine was quiet for a moment. What things? He looked at her. The thing I intend to ask you, he said, when the time is right. She held his gaze. Around them the room went on, the conversation, the movement, the specific bright noise of a large gathering doing what large gatherings did. Edmund, she said. Yes, the time is right. He looked at her. Now, he said. Not in this room, she said. But soon. Tonight, she paused. I told you I was tired of being careful. I find I meant it comprehensively. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. They left at 9. The night was cold and clear, the specific clear of a December night in London when the fog had lifted and the stars were visible above the rooftops, which did not happen often and was worth noticing when it did. They walked back to Belgrave Square in comfortable silence, both of them moving toward the same place at the same pace. Then Catherine said, without preamble, he said I always needed someone to take care of things for me. Edmund walked beside her. He wanted me to be that, she said. Something that required management. It made his departure cleaner, I think. If I was the kind of woman who couldn't manage, then leaving me was almost responsible. Getting out before I became his problem, she paused. The irony being that I've managed everything. All of it. Since November. Alone, not entirely alone, Edmund said. She looked at him. No, she said. Not entirely. They walked. I'm not interested, she said carefully, in being looked after. I want to be clear about that. I have done the work of looking after myself, and I intend to continue doing it, and I don't want anyone to. I know, he said. I want, she paused, finding the word, a person in the room. As you said, I know, he said again. And I want it to be you, she said. Specifically. Not because you were there, or because the circumstances brought us into proximity, or because the wall was thin. Because of who you are. Specifically. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were at the square, the familiar geography of it, the gate, the 2 front doors, the lamp at the corner. The place where all of it had started in November, with a woman arriving and a man who noticed. Catherine, he said. Yes, I want to ask you properly. I intended a better setting than a pavement in December. I like this setting, she said. You're making this difficult. I'm not, she said. I'm making it very easy. Ask. He looked at her in the lamplight in the cold, with the square around them and the 2 houses behind them, and everything that had happened in the distance between them, and asked. He asked simply and directly, the way he did everything that mattered, without ceremony and without performance, just the words plainly. She said yes before he had quite finished. He looked at her. You didn't let me finish, he said. I didn't need to, she said. I knew what you were going to say. You've known for some time, he said. Yes, she said. Since approximately the 2nd week of November, he looked at her. The piano, she agreed. A man who plays badly in the middle of the night because he can't think of anything else to do, that is not a man who is susceptible. That is a man worth knowing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the piano needs tuning. She looked at him. I know. It's been bothering me for weeks. I'll have it seen to. See that you do, she said. It's the least you can do. He almost laughed. She watched it happen, the laugh arriving at his face and being, not quite, expressed, the near laugh that was the complement to her near smile, 2 people managing the same involuntary response to each other. She thought, we are ridiculous. We are both completely ridiculous." She thought, "I don't mind at all." He offered her his arm. She took it. They stood at the gate whose latch had never been stiff, and the December night was cold and clear, and the stars were visible above the rooftops of Belgrave Square. "One house," he said. "One house," she agreed. "Though I'll want to keep the sitting room. I've arranged it exactly as I want it. Keep whatever you like. And Agnes is welcome. She's not very efficient." "No," he agreed. "But neither was I, for several years, and Mrs. Webb kept me anyway." Catherine looked at him. She thought about November, the removal van, the tired face, the wall, the night that had started all of it. She thought about what she had been then, and what she was now, and the distance between the two, which was not very far in time and very far in everything else. She thought, "I came here to manage a legal situation." She thought, "I found considerably more than I came for." She thought, "Good." 1 year later, December came back around. It came the way second Decembers did, with the particular quality of a season you had lived through before and were now living through differently. The same cold, the same early dark, the same frost on the window glass in the mornings. But the frost on the window glass did not matter this year because the frames had been seen to, properly, in January, and the house was warm in a way it had not been warm in the 3 years before that. Edmund noticed this on the first cold morning of the month. He lay in bed and looked at the window and saw clear glass, no frost, the gray December sky beyond it, and felt something he had spent a long time not feeling and was now, gradually and without fanfare, learning to feel again. Ordinary satisfaction. The small, uncomplicated pleasure of a thing that was right. He turned over. Catherine was asleep. He looked at her for a moment, the way you looked at things you did not take for granted, carefully, with full attention, and thought about November of last year, about a wall and a sound through it, and a woman he had not yet met trying very hard not to be heard. He thought how close, how very close to not. He got up quietly and went downstairs to make the tea. The house was one house now. Not in any formal architectural sense. The wall was still there. The 2 front doors still faced Belgrave Square side by side. But the door between the 2 houses, a connecting door that had existed behind a bookcase in the library, and which neither Edmund nor any previous occupant had apparently known about until Mrs. Webb located it in February with the satisfied air of a woman who had suspected it all along, was always open now. The bookcase had been moved. The door stood wide. This was, Edmund thought, the most accurate description of the house's current state. The bookcase moved, the door open, the light from one side reaching the other. Mrs. Webb had retired in the spring. She had announced it at breakfast on a Tuesday in March with the same directness she brought to everything, saying that she had been with the household for 22 years, and that 22 years was sufficient, and that she intended to go to her sister in Bath, and that the household was, in her assessment, now capable of managing without her. Edmund had looked at Catherine across the breakfast table. Catherine had looked at Edmund. "You're certain," Edmund had said. "Entirely, Mrs. Webb had said, with the air of a woman who had been certain for some time and had been waiting for the right moment to act on it. She had stayed an additional month to oversee the transition, had trained her replacement with the thoroughness of someone ensuring a legacy, and had departed on a morning in April with a traveling bag and the expression of a woman going exactly where she intended to go. At the door she had looked at Edmund and then at Catherine and then at the space between them, the particular quality of the space between them, which was not very much space and was full of something she had spent a year watching develop from its beginnings, and she had said, "Good, just that." One word. Edmund had thought it covered everything adequately. He had given her the letter from Catherine and the gift, which was a set of books she had mentioned once, in passing, 8 months earlier, and which Catherine had remembered and tracked down and presented wrapped in paper that Agnes had managed with more enthusiasm than skill. Mrs. Webb had looked at the books, then at Catherine. Her expression, usually so controlled, had done something that Edmund found he needed to look away from for a moment, because some things were private even when they happened in hallways. "Your mother," she had said to Catherine very quietly, "would have been pleased." Then she had gone, and the house had been, briefly, very quiet in her wake. Agnes had cried. Agnes cried at most things, which Edmund had initially found alarming and had come to find, in a resigned way, simply characteristic. She was not an efficient maid. She was, Catherine said, a person first and a maid second, and Edmund had concluded that this was probably fine. They had gone to the Whitmore cottage in April, as Edmund had said she would, on a morning when the country roads were clear, and the hedgerows were beginning their slow spring emergence, and the sky had the particular washed quality of an English April, pale and clean and meaning well. Catherine had been quiet in the carriage, not the managed quiet, the other kind, the thinking kind. Edmund had sat beside her and not required anything, and looked at the countryside going past and thought about all the things that had led to this particular carriage on this particular road, the long chain of small events, the wall and the piano and the gate and the winter that had changed everything. The cottage was smaller than he had imagined. Stone old, with a garden that had gone to itself in the years of absence, and was, as a result, magnificently overgrown in a way that suggested not neglect but the slow reclamation of a place that had been waiting. Catherine stood at the gate for a moment. Then she opened it and went in, and he followed, and she walked through the garden with the specific attention of someone returning to a place they had carried inside them for a long time, touching things, looking, not speaking. In the kitchen she stood at the window, her mother's window, the one that looked at the garden, and was quiet for a long time. Edmund stood in the doorway and waited. "It smells the same," she said eventually. "Old wood and lavender," and she paused. "I could never identify the third thing." "I still can't. Does it matter?" "No," she said. "It's just interesting." She looked at the garden. She was happy here. I used to watch her at this window and think, that's what happy looks like. That exact thing. A person at a window who has nowhere else to be. Edmund looked at her. At the window. At the garden beyond it, returning to itself, green and overgrown and entirely at peace with its own nature. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it looks like." She turned from the window and looked at him, with the full attention, the real attention, and underneath it something that had nothing composed about it. She came across the kitchen, and he met her halfway, because that was the appropriate division of the distance. They stood in her mother's kitchen in the April light, and outside the window the garden was coming back, slowly and without hurry, into what it had always been. Lady Mowbray had taken a position. She had announced it, in her way, at a dinner in February. Not directly, because Lady Mowbray never did anything directly, but through the medium of a deliberate and highly visible warmth toward Catherine that communicated everything it needed to communicate to the room. Robert and the Countess moved in different social circles now. Catherine encountered them occasionally. It was inevitable in a city of this size and a social world of this density. She had crossed paths with them twice since the spring, and both times she had looked at Robert and felt the same thing she had felt at Lady Dalmore's, amplified now by everything that had happened since. Clarity. The clean, uncomplicated clarity of a person who could see a thing for exactly what it was, because they were no longer inside it. She had nodded. He had nodded. The Countess had looked at Edmund with the assessing eyes of a woman recalculating, and Catherine had thought, "You are welcome to whatever conclusions you arrive at." She had taken Edmund's arm, and they had moved on. She had not thought about it afterward. This, she had come to understand, was the real measure, not the absence of pain, but the absence of the gravitational pull, the way a thing stopped trying to draw you back. Robert had stopped pulling. He was simply a person she had once known, standing in rooms she also sometimes stood in, meaning nothing in particular. She found this clean. Entirely simply clean. On the evening of the 1st of December, Edmund came home to find the piano being tuned. He stood in the doorway of the drawing room and watched the tuner, a small, methodical man with the focused patience of someone for whom sound was a precise science, work through the keys, and thought about a November evening a year ago when he had sat down at this piano in the middle of the night and played badly because it was the only thing he could do. Catherine was in the chair by the fire with a book, watching the tuner work with the expression of someone supervising a thing that mattered. She looked up when Edmund came in. "I had him come today," she said. "I thought it was time it was done properly. It's been done twice already this year," Edmund said. "Yes," she said, "and clearly it needed doing again because last week you played that progression and the F was sharp." Edmund looked at her. "The F was sharp," she repeated, with the serenity of someone stating an observable fact. "I didn't notice. I noticed," she said. "It bothered me." The tuner, who had the professionalism of a man accustomed to these conversations, continued his work without comment. Edmund came into the room, sat in the chair across from her, and looked at the fire and thought about the F that had been sharp, and the fact that she had noticed it, and the fact that noticing it had bothered her enough to call the tuner, and the whole long chain of implication that ran from a badly played piano in November last year to this particular moment in this particular room. "Shall I play tonight?" he said. She considered this. "After dinner," she said. "And I'll tell you when the F is wrong again." "It won't be wrong," he said. "He's fixing it. It's always wrong eventually," she said with the serenity. "That's why you have it tuned." He looked at her. He thought about the F that had been sharp, and the cottage in April and Mrs. Webb at the door with her one word and Lady Mowbray's assessment, and a gate whose latch had never been stiff. He thought about December of last year, cold, clear, stars above the rooftops, a question asked on a pavement and answered before it was finished. He thought about the wall. He thought about the wall and what had come through it, and what had happened because of what had come through it, and he thought that there was a version of this year in which he had not listened, in which the training had held, the nothing had remained nothing, the sound had been registered and dismissed and filed as not his concern. He thought about that version and felt the particular cold of it, the specific cold of a thing that almost didn't happen. How close, he thought. How very close to not. That night after dinner he played. He sat at the piano that had been tuned and played the progression he had played for the first time a year ago in the middle of the night, slowly, without hurry, the same shape of sound. Catherine sat in the chair by the fire with her book closed in her lap. She was not humming. She was simply there, present in the room on the other side of no wall at all. He played. The F was not sharp. The house was warm. Outside, December was doing what December did, cold, dark, the city going about its evening self. The lamp at the corner of Belgrave Square threw its light through the window and across the floor, the same light it had always thrown, falling now on a room that was not the room it had been a year ago. At some point, Catherine set her book on the side table and came to the piano. She stood beside him and looked at the keys and then, without preface, reached across and played the melody. The simple, unhurried melody that the progression had always been underneath, but that he had never known, that had been there all along waiting for someone who could hear it. He kept playing the chords. She kept playing the melody. Neither of them had arranged this. It simply happened, in the way that the right things happened when the conditions were right, without planning, without effort, without anyone having to decide to begin. They played together in the warm room while December pressed against the windows, and the lamp outside threw its light through the glass. And the house, one house, the bookcase moved, the door open, the light from one side reaching the other settled around them with the quiet of something that had finally, entirely arrived. He had listened for 3 years to the silence of his own house and called it peace. He had been wrong about that, and the wrongness had not troubled him because he had nothing to measure it against. Then the wall had stopped being only a wall. Then there had been something to measure against. He had learned in the year since that peace was not the absence of sound. It was not the absence of anything. It was not a subtraction, grief subtracted, loneliness subtracted, the difficult things removed until what remained could be called quiet. It was the opposite of that. It was a room with a fire in it, a piano that needed tuning, a woman who noticed when the F was sharp and said so, plainly, without apology, because she had decided that plainness was better than management and had been right. It was the sound of two people playing the same piece of music from different sides of it and finding, without having planned to find it, that they were playing the same song. It was December, and frost on the outside of nothing, because the frames had been seen too. It was full. It was warm. It was, simply and completely and without any further qualification required, home. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it kept you listening, we'd truly like to know where you're watching from. Those comments mean more than you might expect. And if you enjoy stories like this, told with care and attention to detail, consider subscribing. It helps us continue creating, refining, and bringing you even more compelling stories with every new video.